Welcome back, everyone. This is Angel Miller with Phalanx, and that's phalx.com. And this week we're speaking with author Richard Smoley. He's the author of numerous books on various aspects of religion and spirituality. His books include Inner Christianity and How God Became God and Supernatural, among others. Richard, thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks very much. Perhaps you could just go into your background a little bit, who you are, how you became interested in the subject, and that kind of thing.
Well, I've been interested in spirituality, really since my, for a very long time. Although during my high school years and my college years, it was more or less dormant. But in the late 70s, I was at Oxford, and I started going to a very small group of people who were meeting to study the Kabbalah. And I found this very powerful and satisfying. And that was the start of, shall we say, my formal work in all of these areas. Later, I moved to San Francisco and kind of participated in a lot of different things out there, including studying Tibetan Buddhism and working with a book called A Course in Miracles, which some of your listeners may have heard of. Around the age of 30, I decided that I may as well do something professional that actually was of interest to me. Yeah. So I started working and writing about these topics for various magazines, including the one that had just been launched at the time, which was called Gnosis, a journal of the Western Inner Traditions. And I did a little bit more work and more for them. And I was editor of Gnosis starting in 1990 and going through 99 when it stopped publishing. Yeah. That happened to be the 80s and 90s happened to be a very fortunate window for small magazines for lots of different reasons, including the rise of desktop publishing, things like that. Right. But the economic climate turned against them in the late 90s, and it became obvious at that point that it wasn't going to be sustainable anymore. So that was that. And then I started writing a number of books. The first one was with Jay Kinney, who is founder of Gnosis, and it's called A Guide to the Western Inner Traditions. And this is simply, a street-level introduction to things ranging from Kabbalah, which I mentioned, esoteric Christianity, Gnosticism, ritual magic, Sufism, and various other things. It was successful. I continued to do writing on my own. Inner Christianity, which is a guide specifically to esoteric Christianity, and what that specifically is something we can discuss if you choose, and other similar works. For the last 8 years, I've been editor of Quest, which is the journal of the Theosophical Society in America. The Theosophical Society is a long-standing organization that has really been devoted to the study of these kinds of things. As its charter puts it, the power is latent in man. So, and books have continued to come out. My latest two are The Deal, A Guide to Radical and Complete Forgiveness, which owes a lot to A Course in Miracles. And the latest one is How God Became God, What Scholars Are Really Saying About God and the Bible. Now, this last one, which came out in June, is an attempt to talk about the literal truth of the Bible as understood by contemporary scholarship. Okay. There is an enormous amount of work that's been done on it. It's not being buried away, but it hasn't really gotten through to the public in any kind of comprehensive way for lots of reasons, which I expand on in the book. And then as all right, there actually is a lot of the Bible that just isn't literally true.
Right.
with the Hebrew Bible, there's a point at which it starts becoming like real history, but that's a lot later than people had thought. So if that's the case, what are we going to do with all this stuff? In the case of Jesus, Jesus fits into the historical record in Palestine in AD 30, but history doesn't have a lot to say about him because he was not he was not a well-known figure at his own time while he was alive. So again, what is the historical truth of this? And now that we know this and that about them, what are we going to do with that? So that's a very brief kind of capsule summary of my work up to this point.
Well, I mean, it's certainly very impressive, and it certainly covers a lot of different ground. But perhaps we could just go into a little bit about spirituality in the West. You mentioned esoteric Christianity. And it seems to me that there's a couple of things that are going on. I mean, you see the rise of atheism, but at the same time, you also see the rise of sort of alternative spirituality, people who say that they're spiritual but not religious. But I think the Christianity itself seems to be, at least church-going Christianity, is kind of in decline, and people are looking at other religions, sometimes Islam, sometimes neo-paganism. There seems to be something of a religious or spiritual crisis, and with that maybe some spiritual creativity in the West. I wonder what you make of that. Is it a crisis, or is it an opportunity, or is it overblown? Or
yeah, it's of course both a crisis and an opportunity, and it stems at least in part from one key fact, which is that many of the doctrines of Christianity, as traditionally portrayed, have been discovered to be untrue. In some cases, we're talking about historicity. In some cases, we're talking about simple logical consistency. Why, for example, would an infinitely loving God get mad at the human race because somebody ate a piece of fruit in Armenia 6,000 years ago?
right.
And moreover, get so mad at the entire human race that he put them either in risk or in certainty of eternal damnation until he had a piece of himself sent down here to become human and to have it tortured to death. And somehow that made it all right with an infinitely loving God.
Right.
Now, they're divine mysteries. They're things that you cannot express in language. And in a way, then there's also simple nonsense. And I submit that doctrine is the latter. This week, I happened to be talking to a Protestant clergyman of a mainstream denomination who said, well, it's not really, people think it's all about these doctrines and it's really not about that. And I said, well, of course they do, because you've been telling them for centuries that it's all about the doctrines.
Right.
and now you can no longer sustain these doctrines. Well, it's not really about the doctrines after all. Then there's a certain ambiguity about what actually it is about. So there's that. And there's another consideration to be made, which is you could call empiricism. There is very little trust today in received knowledge, in authority, although you do not have to go back in time very far before you saw that as the principal and indeed only source of authority.
Yeah.
Today, some kind of verification is required. In conventional areas, this is equated with a kind of scientific verification.
Yeah.
There's a lot of problems with scientific verification now, and it's undergoing its own crisis of faith, but that's another subject. In any case, people have also gotten the very correct idea that there is such a thing as religious experience, and that it is possible to know something directly for themselves, rather than as mediated through any number of books and leaders and doctrines and churches and so on. So a lot of people are drawn toward that.
Yeah.
And so as a result, spirituality has become very much more investigative. And people also want things that make sense to them, not something that they're told ought to make sense to them, or they're going to hell if it doesn't. So I think these factors are creating the spiritual situation that you're talking about today.
Yeah, I mean, I would add, I think another problem is that the church, perhaps particularly the Catholic Church, seems to become fixated on things such as condoms and things that don't really seem to matter to most people, at least in regard to spirituality, and can kind of become the sort of social work plus hell or something. It's not a very inviting mix, it has to be said.
Yeah, especially since its attitude toward birth control and abortion is not entirely 100% reasonable.
Yeah, and you know, I don't really want to take a position about whether their positions are right or wrong, but it just seems to me that it's become very politicized.
Well, yeah, and the thing about it is, and it follows from the things we've been discussing, because, well, you kind of know your doctrines don't make any sense, and you're not going to dwell too long on them. I mean, the Catholic Church, has its set of beliefs, and you're supposed to believe, but the average Catholic today, particularly in the United States, even the ones who go to church, may or may not believe any number of it, and they don't really have to.
Yeah.
But as a result, what does it mean to be a Catholic? Well, at this point, to be a Catholic, it seems to mean being against abortion, against birth control, for reasons that
Right.
many people don't even really know. But this political identity has become its total identity.
Right.
That creates problems, and it distorts the meaning of religion and spirituality.
Right, very definitely. And I have to say that I don't consider myself a Christian at all. But I used to stay in a Catholic monastery many years ago, and I didn't consider myself a Christian at the time either. But I thought it was important to get to know Western religious tradition for the last 1,000 years or so. But and there it was a completely different experience. It was not like that at all. But as I'm sure you realize, and so one of your books, Inner Christianity, you mentioned the esoteric. Perhaps you could just tell us what inner Christianity or inner religion and the esoteric is exactly.
Well, it has to do with some of the things we've been discussing just now, which is one of the things is this kind of inner experience. Now, it says in the New Testament, the kingdom of God is within you. So, all right, where is it? How do you reach it? This is not terribly well known, by the way.
Yeah.
In fact, in the Gospels, the canonical Gospels, Jesus talks a great deal about the kingdom of God, sometimes the kingdom of heaven. There is no theological agreement about this or what it really means, even though it was obviously a major focus of Jesus' own teaching. And this kingdom of heaven that's within you, well, what is it? Well, it is, shall we say, something that you can go into yourself and discover. It is, well, there's a line from St. Francis, if you like, that says, what you are looking for is what is looking.
Right.
There is a principle in yourself that is conscious, that is aware, that, in a sense, gives life to everything about you.
Right.
It is not your physical body. It is not even your emotions or thoughts or ideas, although many believe that it is. It is something that stands behind that and, as it were, witnesses that. And, well, what is this? Well, it's like leaven in yeast, in that it there's not very much of it, but it, as the Bible says, leaveneth the whole lump. If it weren't for this principle of consciousness in you, you wouldn't exist.
Right.
What is it like? Well, it's like a seed hidden in a field. Well, what does that mean? Well, it's very tiny, and in most people, it's buried because for most people of whatever educational level, whatever social status, these truths are completely buried and unknown, and there's no interest in it and no reason to be interested in it. So it's a treasure buried in a field. It's like a seed cast on the ground. Well, everybody has it, but some people bother to do something with it. Some people don't.
Right.
So if you understand this, A, you have a much more inner perspective, and the reason and B, it changes everything the way you see not only the Gospels but spirituality as a whole. It is, the metaphor goes further because this seed bears fruit; it becomes like a tree, and I can go further into that to developing that metaphor, but that's at least the core of it. And the thing to link this with esotericism is that is esoteric comes from a Greek root meaning further in. And although that has a number of meanings, one I would say is that you have to go further into yourself to know what all of this is about. What I said just now in the last couple of minutes is fairly simple, but it might not be entirely obvious to everyone, and particularly people who don't have some kind of meditative or introspective experience.
Yeah.
And to many people, it won't be of any interest, as I say. When does the game start? And there'll be a small number who, I guess I kind of sense something like this, and I'd kind of like to know a little more about it. And these are the ones who become the seekers.
So how does inner Christianity rub up against outer Christianity, let's say?
Well, the inner Christian tradition has always existed.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes, because it's an orientation and, shall we say, a series of values and teachings, it has existed sometimes within the church and the churches, sometimes without. It very, very early had to become a bit cagey about disguising itself, because all of these doctrines we're talking about, they were matters of incredibly bloody and fierce dispute. And, single words, sometimes even single letters in words of doctrine, could, if you were on the wrong side of the debate, get your tongue ripped out and your hands cut off.
Right.
So that was one reason for the rise of monasticism. You mentioned going to a monastery.
Yeah.
Not the only one, but one of them. And there, in certain cloistered situations, this inner life could be cultivated with some reasonable safety. Originally, the whole monastic tradition, monk comes from monachos, meaning soul or alone. Originally, the monks went out by themselves, and only later did they start to group together. So that was one way of cultivating it. The teachings persisted probably a little more comfortably in the Eastern Orthodox Church than in Catholicism. But they did persist. And, most of the kind of luminaries of esoteric Christianity got into some kind of trouble. One profound visionary was Meister Eckhart, a Dominican monk of the early 14th century. He was called Meister because he was a master of arts, which was in those days an extraordinarily high degree of learning. And he taught at the University of Paris, which was the main theological center. So he was not an ignoramus, and he was definitely not an outsider. Nonetheless, he fell afoul and was charged with heresy. And the only reason the Inquisition didn't get after him completely was that he happened to die just around the time that they were getting started. And you can multiply these examples. The Protestant Reformation helped things a little bit in that the Protestants were, at least in principle, committed to individual spiritual inquiry and were much more open to religious freedom, which is why we have the United States today. Because if it were up to the Catholic Church, we would still be ruled by kings and bishops. I am not a member of a Protestant denomination or any denomination, but any belief in religious freedom at all is the creation of Protestantism, and we have to thank the Protestants very, very deeply for that, even if we don't agree with all of them about everything.
Well, what do you make of the Church's adoption of, say, Aristotle and some ancient Greek philosophy? In that case, would that not be included in sort of inquiry?
Well, it was, and from an intellectual point of view, the adoption of the philosophy of Aristotle in the Middle Ages by the Catholic Church was a very, very sophisticated process.
Yeah.
And, it reached its pinnacle with Thomas Aquinas,
Right.
who was certainly the most important and influential theologian the Catholic Church has ever had.
Yeah.
He was obviously a brilliant man. But Aristotle was fundamentally a believer in the material world. And as opposed to Plato, who thought reality lay in the realm of ideas beyond any physical experience
Right.
as we know it. And this, now, Aquinas, of course, had to say and did say that the revelation of the church was, the supreme authority. But he also said that this kind of investigation, revealed truths about the natural world. Now, this was all well and good, but more and more as the centuries developed, it's not completely Aquinas' fault, and soon this kind of went beyond the bounds of the Catholic Church entirely, but it did set the stage for the materialism that really kind of got going in the 18th century and is still going strong.
What do you think of? There have been quite a few sort of more esoteric movements within Christianity, and some of them within Catholicism, such as Neoplatonism, Rosicrucianism, which was largely Protestant, a Protestant movement, and as well as other smaller movements such as Martinism. Do you have any feelings about those at all?
Yeah, they were vehicles for the perpetuation of, esoteric Christianity, or what one might call inner Christianity. They are the means by which this has survived continually.
Yeah.
Continuously since the earliest times. And a lot of these groups didn't have much favor at the time.
No.
Neoplatonism, which is kind of a development of the ideas of Plato's thought, as its name suggests, was much more important in the church and opened it up, or allowed it to remain open to mystical viewpoints for as long as it was dominant. But it lost this dominance in the Middle Ages with the rise of Aristotelianism. But it went on to influence the Renaissance, the occult philosophy of the Renaissance, which was an esoteric teaching about different levels of reality. Esotericism, has one major theme, is that reality has many different levels, of which physical reality as we know it is only one, and not necessarily the most important.
Right, exactly.
The Platonists and Neoplatonists developed this idea, and the groups you mentioned, the Rosicrucians and the Martinists. The Rosicrucians at least came to the public attention in the 17th century, which is a subject we can discuss if you want. Martinism it came out of France in the late 19th century. And, all of these teachings are a lot more similar than they are different. even if they don't have any direct mutual influence. There is a lot of commonality, and there are a lot of threads likening them to this and to non-Christian teachings such as the Kabbalah, which is, although defined in the dictionary as the Jewish mystical tradition, it's interpenetrated with Christianity and with mystical Islam, with Sufism as well. Why? Because the people who are, shall we say, drawn to these things often feel they have much more in common and can talk much more easily to mystics in other religions than they can to mere external believers in their own faiths.
Right. Yeah.
And this has made interpenetration, much more powerful than I think, even fairly serious academics often admit.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. And this idea of interpenetration of different doctrines or different religions. When you mention that Neoplatonism and Rosicrucianism, etc., represent sort of continuation of esoteric Christianity, I sort of slightly got the feeling that esoteric Christianity, in a certain sense, might be penetrated with ancient Greek thought or pre-Christian thought in a certain sense, because even Rosicrucianism seemed to, and alchemy and Hermeticism around that time brought back a lot of sort of ancient Greek imagery. What do you think about that?
Well, I certainly agree with it. One point to add is that Christianity has been suffused with the Greek philosophy since its beginning. And I'll take one small but very potent example, which is that Greek philosophy at the time of Christ became more and more interested with with something they call the logos, which is usually translated word, although it almost never means word.
Right.
It can mean anything from true story to discourse to reason.
Right.
But in certain philosophical circles at that time, it came to mean something notable, say the Stoics, for example.
Yeah.
It came to mean something like the structuring principle of consciousnness. And the idea that consciousness is the foundation of all things rather than matters conventionally conceived. Now, there was a Jewish sage named Philo who lived, again, just around the time of Christ, although he didn't seem to know of him, who took this concept of the Logos and adapted it to certain Jewish teachings.
Oh, okay.
And Philo's concept of the Logos, as we're talking about, sounds a great deal like the beginning of the Gospel of John. And so whoever wrote the Gospel of John, or that part of it, was either someone who'd read Philo or who was very, very influenced by some teachings that were very, very much like his. And the Gospel of John is pretty much at the beginning of Christianity. So
Yeah.
I would agree with you, but I would say it goes very far back, and it continues to go on. You could write a very long book about how this was played out through the centuries.
So what is the manifestation of all this today, do you think? Because on the one hand, we have many different types of Christianity. Some of them, such as Russian Orthodoxy, which seems to be at the more mystical end of let's say, the accepted religious face of Christianity. And then at the other end, you have something like pro-Israel type movements. And that's quite a spectrum in itself. And then you have other groups such as, which are smaller, admittedly, Rosicrucians, many different types of groups. Some of them are Christian, some of them are probably not. Martinism, which is probably smaller, but again representing a kind of esoteric Christianity. And then we have all these other religions and spiritual movements from Islam to various pagan groups. What is going on that we see all this today?
Well, in terms of movements and organizations, it's very, very diffuse. There are a lot of very small churches, groups. There is a rebirth of interest in Gnosticism,
Yeah.
of the ancient Gnostics. There are Gnostic churches. You can go to a Gnostic Eucharist if you so choose, although you might have to go a bit of a distance depending on where in the country you live.
Right.
There's the liberal Catholic Church, which has nothing to do with the Catholic Church per se,
Right.
but is a very small denomination that is highly influenced by the teachings of theosophy.
Mm-hmm.
They just had their 100th anniversary celebration last February, February 16, and I actually spoke at that.
Oh, okay.
There are many different things. There's a thing called centering prayer, which is an attempt to revive certain meditative and contemplative practices of the Middle Ages. I mentioned A Course in Miracles, which is a very modern channeled text. It was basically published first in 1975. But I think it has a very powerful statement of, I would call, inner Christianity. It's become a spiritual classic. And people are reading the old classics as well. They're reading things like Meister Eckhart. They're reading The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a 14th century English mystical text that inspired centering prayer. So there's a lot of interest in it. And there are a lot of people, and some of these people go to church. Some of them go to pretty much any church you like. Some of them don't. But this is very much alive, but it's very small. It hasn't really hit the radar of the mass media yet.
Yeah.
And this is probably just as well.
Yeah, I would say so, to be honest with you. So we mentioned earlier on that it was a crisis and an opportunity. And perhaps you could just tell us what the crisis may be and what the opportunity could be as well.
Well, institutions go through crises for a number of reasons, of course. But here is one, and almost no institution can avoid this entirely. And I'll start with a simple observation that when you hire someone to do a job, doing his job is, from his own point of view, secondary. Unless he's really dissatisfied, keeping his job is his number one priority. Usually the way to do that is to do the job you were hired for and do it well, which is what most people do, which is why the world works as well as it does.
Right.
But you get a bunch of these people together, all of whom, and I as a working person, have similar, interests. But if you get enough of these people together, you get an institution.
Yes.
And then you get an institution whose primary purpose is the perpetuation of the institution.
Right, yeah.
And whatever thing this institution was meant to perpetuate starts to fall in the background. Sometimes it falls really far in the background so that it starts to subvert the very purposes for which it was created. For example, let's take the notorious case of Catholic clergy and sexual molestation. And people will say, well, that's a tiny minority, but yeah, it is. And it's been going on a long, long time. And it was known for a long, long time. I could tell you some stories. Now, why would the church perpetuate this? If the church's basic commitment were the teachings of Christ, it wouldn't tolerate this for a second.
Right.
But because the Catholic Church's main focus and main source of interest is its own perpetuation, it starts to seem like a good idea to stuff all of this under the rug. And that's the Catholic Church is a very large and visible example, but there are many other organizations and churches who are in pretty much the same position. And to the extent that they are, there isn't much life in them.
Yeah, 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 and as you say, it's not just the Catholic Church, and I mean, it does seem to be human nature, really, doesn't it? In that, even when you look at politics, which is something I kind of have come to loathe, quite frankly, but when you look at politics, you hear people screaming and shouting about some infraction on the other side, and yet when their own side does something 100 times worse, they don't seem to notice. It's quite incredible.
Yeah, well, I mean, the political situation is always faced with this problem, which is Plato. I mean, what you say is certainly true, in my opinion. But as Plato pointed out in the Republic, the best people not only don't govern, but they don't even want to govern.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
I mean, in his view, the people who are best fitted to rule were the philosophers, and that word didn't even mean the same thing as it does now. But because God knows, contemporary academic philosophies would be able to give no guidance or leadership to anything starting
Right.
itself.
Yeah.
But so what you have is here is the people who might actually be the best of the job are the ones who aren't going to want it, and who want it, dominant alpha male types. Um, how many examples of world leaders can I rattle off right now? And I really don't want to discuss these individuals, so I'm not even going to mention any names, but it's pretty obvious. And it's also pretty obvious that this has gone on throughout history.
Yeah.
So it's all of these, bullies and often sociopaths who end up running things because they want to run things. That's all they want, and that's all they know how to do. I mean, is it a tragic situation? Yep. Do we seem to be past it as a species? Nope.
Yeah. No, no, exactly. Yeah. And I don't want to quibble about terminology, but I think it's I don't know if alpha males is maybe exactly what they are. I think you're right. It's basically sociopaths, and it's not exclusively men either, but yeah, it does, leadership or political leadership anyway, and institutional leadership does tend to attract some unsavory characters quite clearly.
Yeah, yeah. I have a book called Political Ponerology, written by a Pole under the Iron Curtain days, and poneros is Greek for wicked. And it's the rule. How the wicked rule. What is it like? What are the structure and dynamics of being ruled by the wicked?
Yeah.
And his view was communist Poland was like that, but that's certainly not the only example.
No, no, not at all, not at all. So since we're in this quite peculiar situation, and it seems that most people are sort of looking around for for a way of life, really, not just a religion as we understand it, but not just something to believe in or something that makes sense of their life, but also practices and ways of thinking about the world. Perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about what you think might be some helpful practices for people today, of whichever religion or spirituality. What would you recommend?
Well, I did mention this thing called the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, which is in you.
Yeah.
Another name you could give it would be the true I, the self, Atman in terms of the Hindu tradition. And as I say, you have it because it's the reason you exist. Whatever means you can have of maintaining or opening a connection to this, meditation of one sort or another is very helpful, usually. That would be one way. And the next step then is once you have contact with, shall we say, this higher self, to maintain a conscious effort to stay with it, because it is very easy to be pulled away by, say, Facebook. I get on Facebook.
Yeah.
All my friends are ranting, and since they're my friends, and since they're still my friends, I mostly agree with them. But it's just as upsetting to hear people whom you agree with rant as it is, to the listen to the opponents.
Yeah.
So there's some need in daily life to kind of keep in touch with this, and it's not really so much a technique, but it's at least worth keeping in mind as an objective. So that's one. Another thing is, I would say, one sense of decency. And I use that word because it's a very flat, unemotional, very unexalted word. But there is something that we all know called everyday decency, common, ordinary decency. You know, treating people kindly, treating other people like human beings rather than as objects to be pushed aside in your life. And in all phases, in all times of life, I think it's important to maintain connection with that. In times that are difficult or stressful, it may feel a little bit more difficult, but then it becomes all the more important to do that. So that, just your own basic common human sense of decency. All the crimes in history, all the great atrocities, if anyone had retained his sense of decency, and there were people who did, and there were people who didn't participate in them, they might not have been able to stop these things, but they didn't.
Right.
And if everybody felt that way, these things wouldn't happen. That is a long way off. So maintaining your sense of decency. Another important safeguard is maintaining your sense of humor. Not everyone has a sense of humor. Some people are simply born without it. I have a couple of friends who said, I don't have a sense of smell. I don't know why. They don't know why. They don't have a sense of smell. Mm. Well, it's not their fault. Similarly, it's not your fault if you don't have a sense of humor. But if you do, it isn't a bad idea to keep in touch with it because, it's some of it is comic and it's a lot of it is better to laugh at than to, get pointlessly outraged.
Yeah, definitely.
So those would be some things. I mean, this is not all a kind of recipe for apathy or distance or indifference or isolation. But, if you want to make a difference in the world, that can certainly be done. Mm. But then it becomes a matter of knowing what your work in the world is.
Right, yeah.
You're not going to do everything about everything. You're not even going to do anything about everything because it's impossible. But, people, I believe, who are generally in touch with this true I or self, whatever you want to call it, eventually do become aware of a kind of calling they have in life, a purpose they have in life, which may seem very exalted, which may seem very mundane, but it is a way that they can contribute and bring some more positive energy to the world.
Maybe just wrapping up, you could just tell us a little bit more about where people can find out more about you and about Quest Books and more especially about your own books.
Well, my books are available on, the usual online sites. My own webpage is innerchristianity.com, INNER, Christianity.com. You can also get there through richardsmoley.com. I do, Quest Magazine is the Journal of the Theosophical Society, and it has an online presence as well. You can read back issues, doing the usual of Googling Quest Theosophical. There are more than one magazine named Quest, so you may have to look for a couple. So those would be ways. I have a lot of interviews up in one place or another online for people who prefer to listen or watch a video rather than read books. So there's a fair amount out there, and the easiest way, as is so often the case, is Googling Richard Smoley and see what you get.
Okay, super. Thanks very much, and thanks for speaking with us. It was excellent.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.